So we've been through a pretty massive journey in this DVD. I think you'll agree. We started off by me showing you some tips and tricks and the basis of efficient scene navigation. And in the following chapter, I showed you the main keyboard shortcuts for navigating and working in modeling and interface tips and tricks, so that we had the basis on which the rest of the chapters in this DVD could follow on. I think it was very important to set that up in the first state because I didn't want anybody to be left behind in future chapters. So, there's a lot of knowledge which you can't really take for granted. So that was the idea, of just to set it up so that everybody was on an even keel. Then we moved on and we looked at what actually polygons are. And this was very important. As I said in the introduction to this DVD, pretty much every 3D package out there uses polygons as the basis for all of their models, and all of the models get tessellated at render time. We looked at tessellation and how that happens, and you can take NURBS patches and spline patches, and you can also take the spline based tools that we have in 3ds Max, and at render time they always get converted into polygons. So polygons are a key feature of any package. You may not actually be modeling explicitly in polygons, but at the end of the day, whatever you're modeling will actually end up as polygons in the render engine. So it's a very important feature, and hence, the focus on it in this DVD. And we looked at the two types of polygonal mesh in 3ds Max, the original editable mesh type and the editable poly. And I just wanted to, hit on that briefly because it's important to understand what the difference is between those two mesh types. People who come to 3ds Max sometimes wonder why there are two mesh types, and it's because of the historical development of 3ds Max. When it was originally created, the edit mesh type was perfectly fine for defining all of the geometry in 3ds Max. But as time went on and the subdivision method of modeling came to the fore, it became evident that a new type of mesh definition was needed, and edit poly was designed to fit that bill. So then we moved on and we looked at primitives and how they get tessellated. And this is explicit tessellation. It doesn't change in any way. You set a parameter and then the mesh gets tessellated. So that's pretty easy to understand. And we also looked at adaptive tessellation, the kind of thing that you have in displacement, and some of the sort of spline tools, you have adaptive tessellation going on in those to a certain extent. So it's important to understand the difference of those between those two things. Then we moved on and we looked at coordinate systems, very, very important for when you're modeling. As you know now, you understand the difference between world space, local space, and then picking different spaces that you want to work in. So you can use any one of those to carry out modifications that you need to on a local basis, or in the sense of the world inside 3ds Max. And it makes a big difference when you understand what the differences are between those various systems. We then looked at the home grid and snaps, and we now understand that we've got this, as it were, sort of virtual table on which we can build things, which is the home grid. And that when we look in the left view, we have another home grid that's perpendicular to us. When we look in the front view, we have another grid. Those are basically all representations of the world coordinate system. Those planes are just, the X, Y, or Z plane that we're actually modeling on at any one time. Then we looked at pivots and why they're so important. I mean, when you move an object, you're working with its pivot, and you're moving that object around within world space, let's say, using its pivot. And the pivot is an offset of the object's transform in world space. So I explained, what the pivot points are and how you could change those. And we also looked at custom home grids. I mean, the home grid is there, but it doesn't have to be the one that you use. You can create your own custom home grids by using the helpers. By creating custom home grids, you can then place objects at angles that aren't necessarily possible using the home grid. And, that can allow you to model certain areas of a set, let's say, in a certain plane. And then when you finish with that, you can snap back and change to using the home grid or any other custom grids that you may have set up. So a very, very useful feature there. Then we looked at two kind of related topics. We looked at the modifiers and we looked at space warps. And we also looked at the stack, which is the user interface that we kind of use to work with these two systems. That most of the deformations that you'll carry out when you're doing modeling will be based on modifiers, and they're based on the object space, the local space of each object. But we also looked at space warps, and they're very similar to modifiers, as we discovered, but they work within world space. So you can use each system for the kind of situation that you find yourself in. If you want multiple objects deformed and you want to add more objects to that deformation later, then really Space Warps are the tool for you. But if you're working on, say, a small group of objects or one object, and you want to create a deformation that sticks to that object when it's translated, then really you're talking about using modifiers. So we explored that in quite a lot of detail in those 2 chapters. We finished off this DVD by looking at 3 chapters where we dealt with the creation of some of the elements of the go-kart model that we're looking at in this series. What we looked at here were very basic elements. We just built certain parts of the go-kart by replacing template objects that I'd placed previously for you. And what I wanted to show here was that, you can move objects along their own axis, rotate them, and we also introduced the snap tool here, which is a very important feature when you're modeling. It's something which I didn't want to really introduce earlier on in the DVD because it requires some practical demonstration, and we're better to demonstrate it in a chapter where it's just used continually. So that's why I thought it was a good idea to actually show you the snap tool there. And I think you'll agree it's a great little tool for when you're modeling snapping objects to each other. Basically getting objects to snap into another object's local space. And once it's in that local space, then you can easily move it along those local axes and keep everything aligned in that particular orientation. So a great feature there. And during these chapters, we looked at modifying some of these primitives. We looked at bending a cube along 90 degrees just to create a kind of L-bar. So we took that a stage further and we actually bent an object through sort of like 180 degrees, really, to create a sort of U shape. And I showed you how we could do that via 2 different methods. One was simply, bending it and limiting it, and then taking it a stage further and actually doing it in 2 stages, and also, limiting the selection using a mesh selection so that we didn't actually bend all of the object. And that hit on something that we looked at earlier on in the DVD, and that is that you can actually limit modifiers by passing on just a subselection to them up the stack. You can just pass on some vertices or some faces or whatever, and you can just pass those up the stack, and then the modifier will only act on those objects, only deform that part of the mesh. So a very important feature there. So that's basically it for this DVD, and I think now you should have a good idea of how to navigate, how to move around, what the different coordinate systems are, what your pivot points are, how to snap, how to use the auto grid feature, how to use the home grid and custom grids. We've seen here how we can build up quite simple elements by using primitives. And then the next DVD, we're going to take it to another level. What we're going to do is we're going to take some of those objects, and we're going to build, using basically cubes, the framework of the go-kart. And it will basically build the entire framework out of just one cube by using sort of polymodeling techniques. It should be a very interesting DVD. We're also going to look at, obviously, all the different things that lead up to that point in that DVD. We're going to look at mesh editing, what the different sub-object types are, vertices, faces, edges, and things like that. Huge amount of stuff to cover. It's going to be a great DVD, so I hope to see you in the second DVD in this series. It's going to be great fun. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the DVD. Experiment, please, with what I've shown you here. Try out your own ideas and, basically check out all the primitives and check out all the space warps and the modifiers. See which modifiers are useful for modeling. Some of the modifiers, it may not say that it's a modeling modifier, but it still could be possibly used for modeling. They're very, very adaptable. And if you can do something with modeling with a modifier, even if it's not intended for that, then, it's a perfectly valid modeling tool. That's one of the great things about 3ds Max. The modifiers are so flexible. That's it for this DVD. I'll see you soon, hopefully, in DVD 2. Bye for now.